A new massacre is committed in Daraa, and the Syrian Freedom Army continues to control many areas in Aleppo. Displaced citizens are targeted in Hama, and the bombardment continues on the city of Arestan amid distress calls.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
Ancak Suriye halkı zaferini ilan eder.
Erdogan says that the Syrian people are close to victory, and Al-Arabi adds that the regime's fall is coming very soon. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. Bashar al-Assad appointed Ali Mamlouk as a new president for the Office of National Security to replace Hisham Bakhtir, and appointed Abdel Fattah, the Sanctity of Military Intelligence Chief, as the vice president for Mamlouk. Meanwhile, the Brigadier Deep Zaytoun was appointed as head of political security, replacing Mamlouk at a time where Rustam Ghazala was appointed as chief of political security. Moving on to the situation on ground, where over 100 Syrian civilians were killed by the regime gunfire today, according to the Syrian Human Rights Network, mostly in Hama and Aleppo, where the Freedom Army took control of the police station after the forces surrendered, while the regime's forces bombed the old neighborhoods, Bab al-Hadid, using helicopters. And later, the Freedom Army took control of these areas after violent clashes with the regime troops, while the fighting extended to include the neighborhood of As-Sukhari after the Freedom Army was able to extend their control over Al-Sakhur, Salahuddin, Masakin Hanano, and Al-Marja.
Allahu Akbar.
These images broadcasted from Aleppo are not of a civilian field hospital, however from a dormitory inside the central prison of Aleppo, showing another merciless massacre committed by the Assad regime on helpless detainees, most of which were political prisoners. Also, more than 15 murdered victims and 10 others wounded were reported so far due to the rocket fire and nerve warfare agent bombs on prisoners who rebelled against the inhumane treatment and daily humiliation that the Assad regime forces put them through. However, the Syrian Freedom Army, trying their best to be ahead of the Assad regime army, successfully blew up dozens of the regime's tanks and military vehicles, as well as taking numerous of the captured vehicles for themselves. This had taken place at a time when they had just declared full control over wide districts of Aleppo, particularly As-Sakhur, Masakin Hanano, Salahuddin, and Bab al-Hadid. The Assad regime forces now have no choice but to shell the areas of which they have lost control over from a distance away. This violent shelling vandalized much of the property in these areas, destroying cars and parts of both residential and industrial buildings. Soon after cleaning up the streets of Aleppo from the Assad regime forces, the civilians of the freed districts come up with a different type of street cleanup, removing the remains of the warfare that took place in the area, preparing for a new and clean start after the removal of the Assad regime.
In Damascus suburbs, the Syrian regime army, backed up by a large number of Shabiha and security forces, have invaded the neighborhood of Nahr Aisha amid heavy shooting and destruction operations that included looting homes and arresting civilians. This comes at a time when the neighborhood of Al-Qadam, Al-Asali, and Al-Tadaman were being bombed since the early morning hours, while activists have said that the regime has committed a new massacre in the Basatine area, while the air attacks continued on Zabadani, killing and wounding many unarmed civilians.
الحقير المجوسي بشار الأسد مدينة ضنير والآن سنذهب إلى الغرفة الأخرى.
In the meantime, activists have reported that they have found at least 14 unidentified bodies in Daraya, and they accuse the regime Shabiha of committing this massacre after a violent raid of arrests, during which many young men were detained.
The bombardment that the regime is carrying out in Syria is not targeting terrorist militias. Instead, it's targeting really young children, which was the case with this child in the village of Ziddin in Damascus suburbs. Another day comes where the heavy bombardment continues in Damascus suburbs, amid news about invasions in the neighborhoods of Nahar Aisha, Barzi and others with tanks and military artillery. This bombardment also targeted civilians and killed more than ever before. The bombing also killed the Palestinian citizens, and it seems like Palestinian people aren't only killed by the Zionists, but are also killed by the Syrian regime. In Daraya, معظمية الشام and Al-Qadam neighborhoods, the citizens spend their day counting dead citizens that are mostly unidentifiable since they are burnt to the bone and horrifically mutilated by the regime's brutality. The citizens of Al-Qabun are still inspecting the faces of the dead civilians to find out if one of their missing relatives are between those who were killed and mutilated by the regime's merciless bombardment on the town. Images start pouring in of the destructions and the ruins that were left after the regime heavily bombed the neighborhood of Al-Qadam, that was later freed by the Syrian Freedom Army, who burned 3 of the regime's tanks and 2 buses that were carrying Shabiha forces, who were on a new killing mission.
لا ننسى سرقة المحلات. جميع البيوت والمحلات انتهكت وسرقت ودمرت.
The regime continues with shedding more blood, while the citizens insist on achieving freedom no matter what. In addition to the Syrian Freedom Army that confirms that the war on Bashar al-Assad will not end unless he falls down.
And to know more about the updates and the developments in Aleppo, we speak to Mohammed Saad, Orient reporter in Aleppo. Mohammed, good evening.
Yes, hello. Today there's a very heavy shelling in all the city areas, especially in Sakhur and Sakin Hamano and Shahar. Today, because of heavy shelling during MiG-23 for the first time in all the Syria, especially in Aleppo, and helicopters and artillery shelling, we have more than 30 injured people. We have more than 7 martyrs. Both of the martyrs are children. Their age are 16 and 10. We have more than 10 houses which is destroyed because of the heavy shelling. There is a heavy fighting between 3 Syrian army and government army. The life in Aleppo now is difficult and dangerous because the shelling is continuing, and every time the Free Syrian Army now has a lot of areas under his hand, as Salah ad-Din Square, Al-Fardos, Al-Amiriya, and Bab al-Hadid, Al-Marja, between 40% till 44% now under Free Syrian Army hand.
Great. So the Free Syrian Army has taken control of some of the areas in Aleppo, but what about the reports of the use of chemical weapons? Have you seen anything that's related to that in Aleppo?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
I'm asking about the use of chemical weapons by the regime forces in Aleppo.
No, he didn't use till now chemical, but shelling for the first time, as I told you, he used MiG-23. It's very dangerous for the people because of shelling from MiG-23 and shelling by helicopters. We have more than 30 injured people. Mm-hmm. Their injured is very dangerous. And
who's taking care of them, Mohammed? Who's taking care of these people? Are they being treated in makeshift hospitals or any other hospitals? Are there any humanitarian aid coming into Aleppo?
Sorry, because the sound is very bad.
I'm asking about the humanitarian situation in Aleppo regarding the 30 people who are injured. Who's taking care of them? What about makeshift hospitals? Any hospitals, any treatment for those injured people?
Free Syrian Army has protected all the injured people and take them to special hospitals under their protect. And we have doctors and we have some people who help and take care of the injured people, so that and we need always some treatment for these injured. But until now, the situation is okay.
Mohammed Saad, Orient reporter in Aleppo, thank you very much for being with us. Coming up later in the bulletin, displaced citizens are targeted in Hama. Welcome back. You are watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. In Idlib, activists said that the regime's forces began to withdraw from the Jabal al-Zawiya area, and they are reportedly making their way into Aleppo. Moreover, 2 people were killed and many were wounded in Ariha after it was heavily shelled.
شهيد الطفل زهراء خبير أريحة 24/7/2012.
And moving on to Daraa, where the regime forces committed a new massacre that killed at least 10 civilians using air missiles that targeted one of the civilians' shelters in Al-Hirak city. Meanwhile, the bombing continued on the city of Sheikh Miskin, and many fierce clashes took place in many areas in Daraa province, where many regime army personnel defected and joined the Freedom Army. Staying in the south, and a new massacre was committed by the regime forces in Daraa as it kept bombing many areas in the town and underwent heavy clashes with the Syrian Freedom Army. More about Daraa we see in the following report.
في هذا الشهر المبارك اتقوا الله يا عرب اتقوا الله اتقوا الله فينا في هذا الشهر المبارك أطفال في عمر الورود تقتل.
The screams of the Syrian people is what consumes the atmosphere in Ramadan, as the people are flooded with massacres and bloodshed. A new massacre was committed by the regime in Daraa, where dozens of civilians and children were killed by the war machinery during the revolution. After 16 months since the start of the revolution, the regime still takes revenge on Daraa, that is witnessing a heavy and fierce military campaigns that reached many of its towns and villages, which was the case in Al-Mata'aya, that was subjected to the bombardment of the regime's military planes. The same situation is repeated in the town of Nasib, where the regime's planes were seen hovering over the area, which was followed by military reinforcements. That is reportedly the first step to an invasion that might cause many losses of lives, whereas in Sheikh al-Miskin, that is still suffering from the aftermath of its previous bombardments, it was also bombed along with Ibta by the military planes, leaving many casualties. Khirbat Ghazali, Al-Qusur and Da'al were all bombed by the regime forces. And according to activists, they broadcasted images that reportedly showed the regime's withdrawal from the area after losing the battle with the Syrian Freedom Army.
5 ساعات لسحب الآليات الثقيلة والمدمرة من قبل أبطال وعناصر الجيش الحر.
The success of the Syrian Freedom Army to cause many damages to the regime's army are shown in Daraa, where the Syrian Freedom Army now has full control over big parts of the city. Daraa is constantly bombed, and its death toll is on a dramatic rise, but it still insists on being resilient towards achieving the goals of the revolution by protesting against the regime.
Politically, the Secretary General of the Arab League, Nabil al-Arabi, said that the Syrian regime cannot last for a long time, and that its days are numbered. And in an interview with the London-based Al Hayat newspaper, Al Arabi said that there is now no talk about political reform, but a transfer of power. He also called on Russia to reconsider its position, especially that the regime's days are almost over. Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan said that the Syrian uprising against President Bashar al-Assad was close to victory, and he hosted a Ramadan fast-breaking dinner for ambassadors in Turkish capital Ankara. He also issued a warning that his country's military had changed its rules of engagement following the shooting down of a Turkish warplane by Syrian air defenses, and that Turkey will not hesitate to retaliate. U.S. President Barack Obama said that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would be held accountable if he made the tragic mistake of using his stockpile of chemical weapons. He added that they are working so that the Syrian people can have a better future free of the Assad regime.
Today we're also working for a transition so the Syrian people can have a better future, free of the Assad regime. And given the regime's stockpiles of chemical weapons, we will continue to make it clear to Assad and those around him that the world is watching and that they will be held accountable by the international community and the United States should they make the tragic mistake of using those weapons. And we will continue to work with our friends and our allies and the Syrian opposition on behalf of the day when the Syrian people have a government that respects their basic rights to live in peace and freedom and dignity. You know how this can work better, so let's get it done together.
In a meeting with the Italian Prime Minister, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that the Syrian leadership and the armed opposition should conduct a negotiation process, stressing that the oust of al-Assad should not be a prerequisite for such a process. Putin expressed concern of the exchange of roles between the opposition and the regime in case of the removal from power is unconstitutional, and added that this will lead to a civil war with an unknown end. The governor of Ninawa, Athil al-Nujayfi, said that the entering of Syrian refugees into Iraq is still not allowed. The semi-official channel, Al-Iraqiyya, said that the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, issued a military order to the police and military forces, as well as the Red Crescent, to receive Syrian refugees and assist them. Coming up later in the bulletin, displaced citizens are still targeted in Hama. Going back to the situation on ground, where 3 victims were killed in Homs and its suburbs, while the shelling was renewed today on Masaida village. Meanwhile, the clashes continued between the Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces in the southern entrance of Al-Hassan Castle. Artillery and mortar shelling also continued targeting Al-Khalidiyya, Jurat al-Shiyah and Al-Qarabis, whereas Al-Ghanto and Al-Hawla and Al-Rastan, Talbisa witnessed heavy artillery shelling. In the meantime, it was reported that prisoners in Homs Central Prison have controlled all its parts amid distress calls to avoid a massacre after the regime's threats.
More of the Assad regime forces' dreadful strikes were witnessed in the city of Ar-Rastan, reported today, while the continuous regime campaign of systematic destruction and killing persisted. And as usual, rocket launchers are still bombing civilian homes in order to utterly destroy everything, unfortunately killing more civilians and wounding many more. Field hospitals filled with the many devastating medical cases which are in very critical medical conditions, all victims calling for desperate help against the oppression they live in daily. Meanwhile, the names of cities we hear over and over again, such as Al-Khalidiyya, Jurat al-Shayyah, and Al-Qarabis, are still suffering the regime's brutality. Activists reported that Jurat al-Shayyah is entirely demolished, which was the cause of most of its residents either being massacred or displaced out of their own homes, seeking safety. And here we are viewing these tragic circumstances that the people of Homs suffered for no apparent reason, pushing them to leaving the streets in which they grew up, now covered by the rainfall of the Assad regime's rockets and shells. However, regardless of this nightmare that they live in, they say that victory is only so far away.
Heavy shelling with artillery continued on Al-Muhassan and Al-Bu Kamal cities, in addition to Al-Ummal and Al-Hamidiyya districts in Deir ez-Zor city. Amid heavy explosions and random shooting, activists reported that heavy clashes took place between the Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces, while a strong blast took place in the Dahiyya district. At least 10 were killed in Hama today as the regime intensified its military campaigns on the city. The regime also targeted displaced citizens who were trying to flee the city. More about Hama we see in the following report.
The tsunami of the regime's bombardment is still on a constant rise against the civilians in the city of Hama, which also increases the number of deaths of those who are killed by the artillery, tanks and rocket launchers of the regime. An entire family was targeted by the helicopters of the regime due to the random bombing that is being launched on displaced citizens in the city of Al-Latamina, at a time where many citizens barely made it to the other towns and find shelter. But it wasn't long until the Shabiha forces slaughtered even the women and children. These events were followed by an intensified helicopter bombing after the town was completely besieged. The same situation was repeated in the city of Kafarzeta, Karnaz, and Sarihin in the evening as they were fleeing their towns. During that time, the regime's helicopters and military planes were still flying over Hama, waiting to target anything that moves in or out of the city. The Syrian regime is still insistent on its policy, not caring about anyone, even though the revolution is still rising against Bashar and his oppressive regime.
Heavy clashes continued for the 5th consecutive day on Al-Qanaitira suburbs, where the regime forces shelled the town, although it's under UN protection. Also, activists broadcasted videos of destroyed and damaged houses and public buildings. And moving on to the coastal city of Latakia, where the regime forces shelled the villages of its suburbs yet again, especially Al-Qastal, Marjazawiya villages, where over 100 bombs fell within 2 hours, as activists reported. Meanwhile, the shelling reached Masayif Selma and its villages, destroying several homes, damaging properties, and burning citizens' farms and fields. And before we wrap up, here's another look at today's top stories. A new massacre committed in Dar'a, and the Syrian Freedom Army continues to control many areas in Aleppo. Displaced citizens are targeted in Hama, and the bombardment continues on the city of Arestan amid distress calls. Finally, Erdogan says that the Syrian people are close to victory, and Arabi adds that the regime's fall is coming very soon. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, please visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching.